Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Son left father's body in morgue to steal his pension and Social Security payments. Contractor charged for booze and sunset cruise. Georgia resident stole over $200,000 in New York State pension benefits. New York City projects a $3 billion surplus for 2015. Newspaper headlines? No. Among the results and findings of hundreds of audits by New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli. Comptroller DiNapoli is here to talk about what he does and how he does it, about the New York City and New York State economy, but mostly we're going to talk politics, Albany politics, dysfunctional politics, big and little uglies. Welcome back, Mr. Comptroller.
I don't know. I thought we were just going to have a friendly chat, but let's go.
Oh, no, it's gonna be friendly but brutal. Okay, let's talk about son left father's body in morgue to steal his pension and Social Security payment. How does your office come up with these stories, and sort of what is your role in all of this?
Yeah, well, you know, we've set up, shortly after I first became controller, a compliance unit within the retirement system to really start to look at those situations where people were ripping off the system, people who weren't eligible for retirement benefits getting them, or cases where people are truly gaming the system. And talk about a Father's Day story, to leave Papa in the morgue and cash the checks. It's crazy.
A long time.
And what happened on this one, because each situation is a little different. In this case, because we've also been establishing strong relationships with other prosecutors, district attorneys,
Sure.
General Schneiderman, U.S. attorneys, inspector generals in federal agencies. So in this case, the Social Security IG got wind of the fact that Social Security checks were being cashed. And they reached out to us and they said, hey, we found this. You might want to check to see whether some of your benefits are being ripped off as well. And that tip got our investigators involved. We realized he was cashing Papa's retirement checks as well.
Well, Papa is in the freezer.
Well, Papa, yeah, in the freezer, not being claimed. I mean, it's you wonder the steps that people go through. You know, there's the other case that you may want to talk about with the Georgia.
Absolutely, yes.
You know, I mean, in that case, I believe Mama was buried, but one left in the morgue. But the same thing, you know, checks being cashed, and in this case, of course, because it was out of state, you know, a little more complicated. In this situation, and it went on longer than it should have, but we did eventually figure it out. What happened was actually a check got returned. And so we started to look and say, well, wait a minute, what's going on? And then a search of the records found that the woman had passed, and yet the child was still, you know, cashing the checks. Now that, unfortunately, went on, as I said, longer than it should have. We're talking about $200,000. So you're talking about big money.
So you do from the sublime to the most sublime in terms of it. I go to your newsroom all the time to read it because they're really fascinating stories here that you could do a TV pilot on this guy leaving his father in the freezer.
I mean, look, it's sad on a lot of levels.
Oh,
right?
yeah, no, I know.
But in this era, Doug, where you know, public pensions are always under a lot of attack, we know in the press, and my feeling has always been our public workers really do work hard and have earned those benefits. It is a promise that I think it's important for us to maintain. I strongly support having defined benefit pensions. Unfortunately, too many people don't have pensions,
right.
So you can have this big issue of people not being able to provide for themselves, my generation and younger generations. But you need to have people having some faith in the system,
sure.
that people aren't ripping it off. So this compliance work, as we call it, and rooting out abuses. Now, you know, we mentioned situations where people are cashing in dead relatives' checks, but there are also situations where people are gaming the system. We had a case where someone had retired, they had a generous pension, and they went back on a local payroll, and because it was in a different it was in a different public employer, it wasn't caught that this person was earning a salary beyond what's allowed under the law, and in that case, it was about $400,000 over time that he had earned as an adjunct professor at Nassau Community College. Well, we are also doing matches now of the different public payrolls. So we're the retirement system for local governments outside of New York City, but they're not in our payroll system, right, if they're not a state employee.
Right.
So we got a law passed where we have access now to the payroll data of the local governments. So we did a match. We said, wait a minute, this guy's making beyond what's allowed under the law. So again, we worked with the Nassau DA's office. Charges were brought, restitution, because we're trying to protect the integrity of the system, send a message, don't think you're going to get away with it. We're also trying to recoup the money.
Sure. Sure.
Because that money should go back into the pension fund for those who've earned the retirement benefits.
So your office does audits of all state agencies and all local governments. How many audits are conducted on average in a year, for example?
In terms of state agencies and state authorities, it's usually 175, 200,
Wow.
depending on the year. Local governments, about 400. So it's a lot. Keep in mind there are thousands of local governments across New York State.
Sure.
And we do some audits of certain New York City agencies. Obviously, the city controller, that's their bailiwick by and large.
Right.
We don't want to duplicate their work. But we've done audits on DOE, particularly Department of Education. We've done audits there. In terms of state agencies, from a downstate perspective, we do a lot on the MTA.
Yeah, and we've talked about that almost constantly throughout our conversations.
It has a big impact on the lifeblood of not only the city, but the suburbs and the whole region. So, again, it's an area where people want to make sure money's not being wasted.
And then just the headline of this one, I really love, contractor charge for booze and sunset cruise. I mean, a little poetry there as well.
Yeah, well, credit to our communications team. And I want to, point out in that case, the contractor is not someone who did, building and construction work on a state building. That was a not-for-profit providing mental health services. It had a contract with the state to provide those services, and instead we found, I think the total there was about $150,000 in expenses that really should not have been allowed, including, a picnic, a retreat, the booze cruise, alcohol, inappropriate kind of expenses. And, again, when state contracts are given out, especially ones for human services,
right,
and money is being diverted for other purposes that, simply, are not contemplated in the kind of direct services that they're getting funded for, we have to hold people to task and hold people accountable. So we look, for contracts with different agencies. We look for red flags, either in terms of some of the payments that may rise to levels of suspicion. But Doug, I have to tell you, we often do our work based on a tip.
Sure.
We'll get a call, we'll get an email. Taxpayer sees something that they think is inappropriate in a community. We had a situation once, this doesn't happen too often, where we went in to do an audit in a local government upstate, and I think it was a village, and our auditor showed up, and right away, I believe the person was the clerk, and she said, "I admit it, I've been stealing money." I was like, wait, we just walked in the door. There was no suspicion, no nothing. She just came clean. Again, sends a message when we come in, we're going to look, but we see, sometimes it's a big government entity, sometimes it's a not-for-profit or a contractor. Of late, we see a lot of the smaller jurisdictions, fire districts for some reason, where very often, you're in a community where everybody knows each other for generations.
Right.
There are no checks and balances because it's a very small little group. And suddenly you're writing the check to pay the bills for the fire district, and then you're writing the check to pay for your own American Express account. And it happens more often. I wish I could say these are isolated circumstances, but they're not. And again, everybody's concerned about money and the lack thereof in this tough economy. And we can't be everywhere, right? We'd like to prevent this stuff before it happens. But our message is we're out there, we're looking, and if you're doing something wrong, eventually we're going to find you. And we have a role to play in that. I'm not a prosecutor. I always have to.
But you have good relationships with AG.
Absolutely, but we are the watchdog.
Right.
And then when we find something, we will then refer to prosecutors. With the Attorney General, we set up a collaboration from when he first came into office, because what happened in the past when I first got there, we would have audits or an investigation, and our folks would go, and audits usually take months.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, then, you get the Attorney General involved or prosecutor. A lot of time gets wasted, and sometimes, frankly, it gets a little stale and may not be pursued. Well, we have this a joint task force on public integrity that we set up. So then when we're onto something earlier, we get a tip. Our auditors and investigators and attorneys are working together. So the prosecutors say, all right, this is what we need to really pursue this case. So instead of a long, drawn-out process, they're on it from the beginning together. We've had now dozens of arrests of elected officials, including some state legislators who were caught up in this, heads of not-for-profits, including some of the big ones that have been in the press. And it's really been a very effective way for us to bring people to justice, get millions of dollars back, of taxpayer money that's been stolen. And we're continuing that effort. I wish we could put the task force out of business, but unfortunately, every time we turn around, there's more and more that's there.
Okay, let's turn to what has to be called Albany idiocy. Is dysfunction back, or is it worse now? It obviously never left. We last talked in January, mid-January. I mean, we're in the middle of the Shelley thing. Skelos buys it.
Right.
The prosecutors subtly or not so subtly threatening the governor. You've got two new leaders. It's a mess.
There have been years like this before, not quite like this one. And one reason why I enjoy being controller is that I'm somewhat removed from the down and dirty of what's going on. But it is, as someone who did spend a lot of years in the legislature, it's frustrating because, these are big issues. I still believe, there are more good people than not in the legislature. And, you really look at the sea change since the beginning of the year. To think that both leaders of each house, one a Republican, would be under indictment and gone. No one saw that coming.
No.
I mean, let's be honest. No one saw that coming. And we know from what, Preet is saying that their work continues. And so what happens next? Who knows?
He's going to drop indictments on somebody.
Well, we'll stay tuned, right? I guess as he said. The problem right now is that between the fact that you have some new leaders, both of whom I know very well, by the way.
I would assume so.
I served with Carl Hastie in the Assembly, and John Flanagan and I actually were both elected to the Assembly in 1986. His father had been in the Assembly, died
forever,
jogging, very sad situation. John, I think, was 25, and he then was designated to run in September. I think this all happened. I was already running, so we served together in the Assembly, and of course he went on to the Senate, and he. I appreciate this. He supported me when I was up for the controller position. So I know both of them to be smart, and they're good political leaders, and I think that given the tough circumstances, they've actually come up to speed pretty quickly. The problem is they're replacing two leaders that had an ongoing working relationship with the governor,
right,
and had been through multiple opportunities to know how to close a deal.
Right, with multiple governors, in fact.
Certainly in Shelley's case. Yeah. I guess with Skelos, I don't know that he was a leader with anybody other than
Cuomo.
But he had been in a leadership position, not
right,
the leader.
Right.
So there's there's a little bit, but I think that you have another factor in play right now, and it's not necessarily bad, by the way. Especially on the Assembly side, you have a whole cadre of newer members who are asserting themselves.
Yep, and they asserted themselves in Shelley.
Well, there's no question
going. I mean,
there's
clearly
no question
that was the revolt.
They said things have got to change, and I think Carl Hastie became Speaker with a commitment to be more inclusive with members. Now you've got, I lost track of how many there are, but there are more than 100 right now, right? And I've been in that caucus room, and they're from all parts of the state.
Right.
It's very hard to get a consensus.
Right.
So
150 cats is hard to herd.
Yeah. I mean, so the good news is the members are empowered and have more to say. The bad news is I think it's harder, for the Speaker to come up with a unified position. But I certainly think from the Assembly perspective, and it's very clear, the rent protections in the city and beyond. I'm a Nassau guy. We run stabilization there too. That's a very, very key priority, and that becomes a key item for them. The Senate has their own list of priorities, so they've got to figure out how to mesh with each other as well. And I think everyone's a little nervous. They don't want to look like they're doing something because some favorite constituency is getting it, because does that now create an impression that there's something illicit about that?
So your sense is also that Preet Bharara and the investigations has had some kind of dampening effect on legislative activity and on
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to gauge. I think there is a sense that, certainly these items that are related to the real estate industry.
Sure.
I think there is a sense that there should not be a perception, or certainly not a reality, that any positions are being taken because of special interest or campaign contributions.
Right.
It's all a fuzzy area, though, because, people are entitled to contribute to people who support their positions.
Oh, yeah.
I think the real issue, from my point of view in New York, is that we have such liberal amounts that are allowed in contributions. I think now for statewide offices, you can contribute like $65,000 per. I mean, it's crazy amounts of money. So we've yet to deal with that issue of campaign finance reform. I personally, we've talked about on the show, I believe strongly in public financing of elections. Is it a panacea? No. Is it perfect? No. But we have to do something to drive out these big contributions, which at the very least create an impression.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court's not being very helpful.
Well, you're right, but New York City still has a matching funds program, which is held up even with the court decisions. And while someone could always opt out and put in their own money, I think...
Like Mike Bloomberg for $250 million over 3 elections.
Yeah, but by and large, I think in the city it has worked to provide more competition and to give people another path that doesn't require them to just raise these huge sums of money. So I think until we deal with that, some of these questions and concerns are going to be out there. Look, there will be a resolution because there always is. And I've been there in those years where it was dragging on July, August.
Oh, well,
and
you
then all
were
of a
there
sudden,
when it was really...
It was crazy. And then all of a sudden, everything gets decided. But
One big log roll. It's really the big ugly.
Here's where the problem... You're right. And you even saw that as part of this year's budget process. When it becomes leaders making a decision last minute, and then they print the bills, and they get a message of necessity, and they got to vote on it within hours, what happens is the public and the press barely knows what's going on.
And the members,
what's I going to say? And the legislators, they're just being asked to vote on something after, and I've been there, being briefed by staff without having the time to really read it and fully absorb it. And then sometimes they find out afterwards, right? What was it there? Like in the budget this year, the tax break for the yachts, right? Well, I don't know how many of them really knew that was, in there, right? So this is the bad part, is that you do have the potential, because 4th of July is coming up and it's going to be the summer. If they break the logjam, and of course the other problem is if they have a tenuous consensus, they also want to get it done fast before the consensus falls apart and there's criticism. But then you will get back to that bad notion where legislators barely know what they're voting on. The public and the press can't really analyze the details, and you've got some big issues out there. Mayoral control.
Rent.
The rent is a huge
421A with the tax.
I mean, these are some very, very big issues. The whole, it's kind of punted to the border regions, but you still have lingering concerns about teacher evaluation, the whole education
Absolutely.
agenda. A lot of raw nerves out there.
Yep.
Charter schools,
Yep.
caps.
Yep. All of it.
No one's talking about MTA, capital plan funding.
Well, you have $14 billion in the hole. Come on. Wait a second.
That one's being punted to the future, and that's a problem.
Kicking it down the road. Come on. To how many million people? 6 million people write it a day. I'm one of them. Well, it's crowded. The signals are breaking down. The city's abdicated, and the state.
Well, I mean, the city and the state, in fairness, each kicked in a little more, but it doesn't go anywhere near closing the gap. So you have to look long-term, fundamentally, how you're going to deal with this, because the economy is better. There's no doubt about it. In the city.
The city. I mean, your audit shows that we're in really good shape.
Well, but it also means more people are working, right?
Right.
And more people are using the transportation system.
Right.
And tourism is still up very high.
Yep.
So you have all that together. And if people are frustrated because, the stations are dirty, the on time is an issue, the crowding, and if the infrastructure falls into disrepair, as we saw in the past, well, then the whole thing starts to unravel.
Right. And the numbers, I mean, certainly the numbers that you report are really astoundingly good for the city in terms of economic growth. $3 billion surpluses, small out-year gaps.
Yeah.
Come on.
Way in excess of the city's projections. Look, Wall Street's back being profitable. They're hiring again. That was one of the big issues we've talked about in the past, that Wall Street's making money, but they're downsizing. Well, towards the end of 2014, they added about 2,000 positions. They continue to be adding. We think this year it'll be, like 4,000 added. And those jobs tend to be well-paying jobs. They generate economic activity in other parts of the economy. and Wall Street profits benefit the city, benefit the state. You know, and part of why you see now the mayor and the city council coming together on
the new budget,
and more police officers, which
1,300,
right? And they're only asking for 1,000 now. So
right,
well,
and the mayor says, "Well, you're not going to get any," so it's 1,300.
Well, because they have this money now that hadn't been anticipated,
and then they're also acting somewhat fiscally responsible by putting in each of these funds
in the reserves, which is very important to build us up for the other post-employment benefits and for the rainy day funds. You know, look, the real issue is going to be this. Are we headed for, just look at financial services, are we overdue for, I don't want to say a meltdown, we don't want to go through that again, but a correction that will reverse some of those trends in terms of profits? If interest rates, or when they go up, I shouldn't say if, you know, what will the impact be? Will now the hiring slow down? If because of the global economy, Greece, whatever,
right.
The folks from Europe who've been coming here spending a lot of money, if they feel that they can't now, or because the euro is a lot less valuable than the dollar in terms of the exchange rate, it's good for people going to Italy.
Thank you.
But it's a good year to go, Doug. But will now the city see a reverse? So that's why building up those reserves, there is a little bit of a cushion there. You know, the challenge for us from a statewide perspective, though, is that as great as the city is doing, a lot of other parts of the state aren't doing that.
I live in Delaware County, and we ain't doing good at all. It's still
yeah.
You know, agriculture collapsed. I mean, you really have very little opportunity in vast regions of the state.
Well, and my personal view, you know, is that casinos aren't going to solve those problems. You know, although that's being held out as one of the panaceas. You know, agriculture is still an important part of the state's economy, and New York is different than other states in that we're largely family-owned farms still.
Right.
And we did an updated ag report for the state, and I've been traveling now. The weather's a little better, and we're going to do a little more in terms of focusing on agriculture. You're right. In certain communities, it may not be as strong as it once was, or it's disappearing, but, you know, in many parts of the state, it's still very strong. We need to figure out how to keep it strong as part of a diversified economy.
Yep.
You know, there's more being done, you know, with some of the economic development programs. We're looking at those a little more carefully.
Yeah, I mean,
because you have to. IDAs, and I have to say, you may call low-hanging fruit, but we actually got an IDA reform bill passed by the legislature. Industrial development agencies, which are set up to be, you know, they give out tax breaks and benefits to help encourage job development projects.
And they're usually not evaluated for such.
They're not evaluated, or they give benefits to a project that doesn't produce the jobs. Or, you know, they're doing something that's taking jobs from somewhere else and it's just moving, shuffling around.
Right.
Or people who have a political connection get, you know, not all. In fact, there are many good ones. But we do an annual report that talks about what kind of jobs are being created for how much money is being spent on benefits. But we had a reform proposal, not everything I'd like to see, but we were working with those in the economic development area, people involved with IDAs and with labor. We got consensus support to have more uniformity in applications and in the evaluation process, to ensure that the IDAs have what we call a clawback provision. If you give the benefit, the tax break, and whatever, 500 jobs supposed to be created, 100 jobs, whatever number, and those jobs don't get created, you have to provide an arrangement to get back, to recoup those benefits.
Sure.
Why should the business get the benefit and not deliver on the promise? So I'm hoping, and this got past both houses just in the past couple of weeks of end of session, and I'm hoping it's one that the governor will sign. So I guess in some sense, because some of those big issues have been a logjam, some of the smaller items, but are still significant, actually are being dealt with. And this modest IDA reform, I think, is an important positive step. First time we've had IDA reform legislation in a long time.
And we don't have it and we need it at the city level as well as at the state level.
Yeah.
Talking about, let's go to the governor. Your favorite kumbaya topic.
The guy in Jersey?
Not my governor.
Oh, I thought you meant your
governor. I
governor.
have two governors. I don't know which one. I don't know. I can't escape either one of them. I'm not being facetious. It seems to me that the governor, in some sense, is losing it. He's fighting with everybody. And it's sort of like an arcade game. The rabbit jumps up and you shoot him. There doesn't seem to be the coherence that there once was. Is that...
Well,
I know I'm putting you in an awkward position, but I did it on purpose.
Really? I'm so shocked. Look, this year, how did this year start, right? Former Governor Cuomo passed away. The whole program for the state of the state budget was put off. And the governor, gets back into action after very eloquently honoring his father at the service. He gives his blueprint for the year, kind of a combined, state of the state and budget.
Yep.
And the next day the speaker's, indicted. So I think this whole year everybody's been off their game because it's like, it's just been one of those, crazy years. The governor in New York has tremendous power. It's one of the strongest governorships anywhere. So to the extent that there is an agenda happening, a lot of it, will still be driven by what, the governor's priorities are. And I think just as Carl Hastie and John Flanagan are figuring out how to work together, the governor's trying to figure out how to have a working relationship with these folks. So, look, the reality is we need Governor Cuomo to be successful. We need the legislative leaders to be successful. So I'm still going to be the optimist that they'll figure out how to get it all back on track.
I'd like to be convinced of that, Mr.
Well,
Controller.
time will tell.
Okay.
Time will tell.
Okay. Moving, in a sense, away from politics and one more time back to economics, looking forward in both the city and the state. What are you seeing from your vantage point right now in terms of the economy and budget over the next year, 2, 3?
Well, I certainly think overall we're still in a recovery mode, and that's good news. The challenge from a state perspective is that we have to have a more evenly distributed economic recovery. So the issue that we just touched on briefly with so many regions of the state north of New York City struggling, that's a real issue.
Okay.
And until some of that turns around, from a state perspective, I think there are going to be some challenges. What's helped the state from a budgetary point of view has been all these bank settlements. Something like $7.5 billion coming in. Now, that's money that's not really being used for ongoing programs, nor should it be, but that has relieved some of the budget pressure. There's no doubt about it.
For example, on the Tappan Zee Bridge build-up,
right, and some of that money is being put aside for upstate economic revitalization. I personally think those one-time windfalls should be almost exclusively given to infrastructure.
Sure.
Because such needs there.
Absolutely.
That could have included, more MTA infrastructure
Which
as
it
well.
didn't.
So, so I think for the state, the budget that was put together by the government legislature is holding together. Tax revenues are coming in pretty much as projected or better. So, I think the economy is humming along, reasonably well, even though it's uneven. And the city, as we talked about, is doing better than anybody expects. The problem is how long does it last, right? At some point, some of this slows down. So that's why building up reserves, and the state did it as well in this budget, and understanding that nothing is forever. Look how strong the market has been for how many. It's the longest, I think, run.
Yeah, and the number of jobs that we're adding at the city level is you're adding whole cities almost to the
but one of the
working population.
But one of the challenges is long term. Many of the jobs that are being created have been replacing jobs that were at a higher wage scale. So
Right.
you have a lot in retail.
Yep.
In health, entertainment. Thank God they're jobs,
Sure.
right? But so there is some structural change in the city's employment profile. That's why Wall Street's starting to hire again is very, very good news. How much of that are people who are going to be trading and making money? How much of those are compliance people who are making sure that they don't get into more trouble?
Right.
But that's a growth area,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Compliance. So,
Okay.
But that's attorneys and people with credentials to do that. So so short run, I think we're humming along. Long run, it's not going to last forever. So my position as control has always been caution.
Okay.
Don't make commitments that long term you may be caught short on.
Okay, we have to end here.
What do you mean?
We're 2 minutes over there yelling at me at the control room.
Oh,
You wanna
my
keep
Lord.
talking?
Happy sabbatical. We're going to miss you, my friend.
Man. And then when you come back, I'm going to look at this tape and make sure that every I is dotted and T is crossed here.
I would expect nothing less.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.